Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Sarah and I live here in the Kingfield neighborhood, and I am happy to introduce this conversation on MPD 150, a People's Project Evaluating Policing. And I want to first thank neighbors Kim and Aaron. If you could give a little hand wave if you're there on camera. I want to thank Kim and Aaron for helping to put together these sessions. As well as Sarah Linus Robinson from the Kingfield Neighborhood Association for helping with the logistics and the promotion and the recording tonight. So tonight we have part one of our conversation, which is focused on a history of policing. And our presenter will be Dr. Sujin Pate, who I will introduce in just a moment. But first, a couple of quick announcements. So first of all, next Tuesday, May 4th at 7 p.m., we will have part two, which is creating the future of community safety. And this conversation will be facilitated by Sheila Najad. So everyone's invited to attend that session as well. And I know many of you have already registered, so that's great. If you have any questions about registration, I'm happy to answer those questions. And I'll drop that link in the chat in just a moment here. So beyond these first two sessions that are presented by MPD 150 work group members, our plan is to schedule some additional sessions in the neighborhood focused on conversation, continued learning, and very importantly, action, what actions we can take together as a neighborhood. And these additional sessions are being planned by Kingfield Neighbors. So if you have any interest in helping to plan and facilitate those conversations, please let me know and we'll get you linked into that group. And everyone who registered tonight will be emailed information about participating in those conversations. And we welcome, people, whether they've been a part of these first two conversations or not, to take part in that. And this is all part of, it's all being put together based on feedback that we've received from neighbors as part of Kingfield's 100 Days of Community. So many of you have probably seen 100 Days of Community has been taking place the last couple of months and going into May. And certainly we want to have community beyond those 100 days, but really it was envisioned with the pandemic, with the trial of Derek Chauvin and coming into the 1-year murder of George Floyd. This 100 Days of Community is envisioned as a way to get neighbors connected, have conversations about safety, and come together as a neighborhood for anti-racist learning and action for safety beyond policing. So this conversation tonight is by no means the only conversation. There's still lots more learning and action to come. For this conversation tonight, I'd like to propose some conversation guidelines that are adapted from a neighbor here in Kingfield, Jean Greenwood, who facilitated a circle dialogue last week and who is trained in restorative justice. Jean uses these guidelines when she facilitates circle dialogues, and I think they're also very relevant for our presentation tonight. And so I'll put these in the chat as well, but they are: we will speak and listen with respect. We will share from our own experiences, thoughts, and feelings, and we all share responsibility for this conversation. And so as a neighborhood, as neighbors, we're here to be accountable to one another and to this speaking and listening with respect. So with that, I am honored to introduce our presenter tonight. Dr. Sujin Pate is an educator, writer, and diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant dedicated to centering the lives and experiences of historically marginalized peoples. She's an alum of Howard University and the University of Minnesota, and was named Educator of the Year in 2014 and Ally of the Year in 2013 by Macalester College. She is the author of From Orphan to Adoptee, U.S. Empire and Genealogies of Korean Adoption, co-host of the Anti-Racist Parenting Podcast, and co-editor of the anthology in progress, Ode to George, Reflections on George Floyd's Memorial Site at 38th in Chicago. Sujin volunteers with MPD 150 to sow seeds of abolition and is a proud steward of A Million Artist Movement. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sujin Pate to our conversation here in Kingfield.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Sarah, for that introduction and for inviting me. And I just want to also thank you all for being flexible and joining us today. It was really important that we honor what was happening in our country and also in our city during this time last week. And so we're meeting on the heels of Derek Chauvin being charged for murder of George Floyd. And I can't express how huge this moment is, how significant that verdict was. We're living history, and this is a historic win for all of us, but especially for the Black community, because rarely, if ever, are white men held accountable for murdering Black men, especially if the white man is a cop. And if you think that George's death in the context of lynching, or if you think about it within the context of lynching, then it's even more historic, because the conviction rate for lynching an African American has been 0.000058%. So to put that into perspective, you're 15 times more likely to make a basket from half court than a jury is to convict a white man for lynching a Black person. And if this statistic isn't striking enough, up until the 1960s, murders in the US had a clearance rate of nearly 90%. So accountability or justice was a near certainty for families of victims, just as long you weren't a Black family with a loved one who was murdered by a white person. So in spite of killing over 1,000 people per year, American police are above the law as much as they were during the nearly 100 years of American lynching. So over 10,000 people have been killed by American police since 2005. 10,000, over 10,000. But only 54 officers have been charged, and almost none of them have been convicted. So Tuesday's verdict was a big deal, a very big deal. And while this is a huge win, it's only a start. We all have a role to play in making sure that this historic win spurs even greater, more substantive changes in making our society more equal. And I'm hopeful that after attending this session, you'll leave with some concrete ideas on how to plug in and make that happen. And before we get into kind of the meat, or the heart of the program here, I want to acknowledge the land that we're on. So we live on sacred indigenous land that is home to the Dakota, Anishinaabe, and Ho-Chunk nations. Minnesota comes from the Dakota phrase Minnesota Mokoche, meaning land where the waters reflect the clouds. And this picture here I took at Makaska, which I just feel like is a wonderful illustration and demonstration of how apt the name of our state is. Bodote, Minnesota means where two waters come together. So Bodote, Minnesota are where the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers converge. Is a place where Dakota people were created by the land thousands of years ago. So that area is an especially sacred site because that's the center of the world for the Dakota people. It's their origin story is where that lies. And Minneapolis, St. Paul is home to one of the largest and most tribally diverse American Indian communities in the nation. More than half of the state's American Indian population reside right here in St. Paul. So the purpose of land acknowledgements is to raise awareness for those of us who are non-native that we're living on and occupying land that is simply not ours. And it's also done to honor and recognize the original stewards of this land. But land acknowledgements are empty if there are no actions behind them. We need to honor them through our action and not just through words. And I don't want anything that we do here to be lip service. I don't want anything that we do here to be empty. If you don't take action on what you learned during our time together, it's as if you were never here at all. So in that spirit, I want to encourage you to think about what you can do to be in right relationship with the peoples whose ancestral homes we reside on. And I'd like to share with you what I've been doing for the past 6 years. I've been donating to this organization, Mokoche Ikichupi. And this is from their information is from their website. Who we are. Mokoche Ikichupi, meaning land recovery, is a project of reparative justice on Dakota land in Minnesota, Mokoche. The Mokoche Ikichupi project seeks to bring some of our relatives home, reestablish our spiritual and physical relationship with our homeland, and ensure the ongoing existence of our people. Because why? Our cultural survival depends on it. And why do we matter? Dakota people were systematically dispossessed of our homeland, and we currently reside on about 0.01% of our original land base within the borders of what is now the state of Minnesota. Our work is a positive action to help repair the most fundamental harm of settler colonialism, indigenous disconnection from the land. So, in a nutshell, this Dakota-led project is working to buy back land, which in and of itself is highly problematic, given that, that they have to buy back the land that was already theirs in the first place. That is for another conversation. But anyway, this project that's working to buy back land to restore Dakota culture and way of life, as well as bringing Dakota people who were forcibly removed from this land back to their ancestral homes. It's a project that is working to rectify the harms of the past. I want to help rectify these past injustices, so that's why I donate. I look at it as paying rent on the land I occupy. So just like my monthly mortgage payment, I set up an automatic monthly donation, and I highly encourage you to do the same. It's one small yet significant action you can take to help Dakota people get their land back. And one more thing I want to say before we move on. Taking away land was the primary method of genocide used against them. So helping them get their land back works to remedy genocide. So help them get their land back by donating to this organization. So the agenda for today is as follows. What is MPD 150? We'll be answering that question. Then we'll do a short polling activity that assesses your knowledge around policing. And then we'll talk about some of the common myths around policing, and I will be dispelling them. And then we'll talk about reform, defund, abolition, what they are and how they differentiate from each other, since these are pretty key concepts, regarding this conversation. So what is MPD 150? It is a collective working to sow seeds of abolition through the distribution of the MPD 150 report. This thing right here. Its mission is to change the story around policing in Minneapolis in order to dissolve it, to dissolve policing, and to tell the truth about the history of policing, the core function of the police, and its ineffectiveness in creating public safety. Because why? Creating public safety is not a part of their core function. It never was a part of the core function of police. And so how do we accomplish this mission? Through storytelling. So here, this is Ricardo Levins Morales and Sheila Najad, who are core members of MPD 150. And in 2016, they came together and started this collective. And the whole point of it was to conduct a people's performance review of the 150-year history of the Minneapolis Police Department. No performance review had been done up until that point. Not internally, not externally. So this was the first one that we did as a community. It was released in 2017, and we've used this report to offer a counter narrative to the myths of policing. The expanded version, which you see here and which I had shown, was released in 2020 with the accompanying comic book about how community policing is a marketing ploy to make policing sound benevolent and good and for the people, when it's just another way to expand the reach and control of police. A little bit about me. How did I get involved? Well, I've been involved in anti-racist work through my work as a professor, a writer, an organizer, and a DEI consultant. And like many people, witnessing the public lynching of George Floyd changed my life. Specifically, it lit a fire in me to redirect my energy towards this work. So my daughter and I, we spent last summer, immersing ourselves in the history of policing in this country. She took a class offered by Freedom Lifted in collaboration with the Chicago Freedom Schools and Asada's Daughters. And I did my own self-education, reading books, articles, listening to podcasts, attending webinars, etc. And at that point, prior to this education, I was a total reformer. I was reformer all the way. But as I learned more about policing and how it replicates the logic of slavery, I realized that abolishing the police in our present context is parallel to the project of abolishing slavery back then. And I asked myself, if I were living during the times of slavery, which side of history would I want to be on? When I think of myself in the context of slavery, I fancy myself as an abolitionist in the 18th or 19th century. I want to believe that I would have been on the side of abolitionists. And so I wanted to align that projection of myself with the actions I'm taking in this moment, in this century, which led to committing myself to being an abolitionist in the 21st century. So I remember that Ricardo Levins Morales reached out to me in 2016 when MPD 150 was just starting to help with the report. And I wasn't in a position at a time to help at that time, but I didn't want to miss another opportunity to help with the cause. So I reached out to him in July to see if they needed volunteers, and they did. And so I've been involved with them ever since, primarily working to distribute 20,000 of these reports, working with McAllister students and others to sow the seeds of abolition by getting the report into the hands of as many people as possible. Because with education, there is power, and there is so much misinformation and disinformation regarding policing in our country and in our city. So I have a short poll that I'd like for you to participate in. No big deal. I'm just curious to see what prior knowledge you are coming in here regarding the police. So Sarah LR will be posting the questions. Okay, well, it looks like, oh, okay. Just waiting for one more. It looks like most everybody has voted. So let's just go through this. So every society, do we need to end the poll for people to see the results? Like, can people see the results?
Okay, I'm gonna end it, Sujin, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, hopefully we can see the results. Okay. Okay. So based on the first question, every society has police to help reduce crime and harm and to protect people. The answer is false. Yes, that is true. Yep, that's correct. It's false. Not every society has police, and therefore not every society needs police. On which activity does the police spend most of their time? Responding to non-criminal calls was the top answer, and yes, yep, that is correct. The majority of the time is spent on non-criminal calls, and it's typically around a third of their time is spent on that. On which activity does the police spend the least amount of time? Crime prevention. The answer is violent crimes. So close, very close. It's a mere 4%, folks. 4% of their time is spent on this. And yet, people who are against abolition, that's the first thing they'll talk about is, well, what about the violent crimes? What about them? They make up 4% of the time that the police spend on. From the 1960s to the present, how many opportunities has the MPD had to reform itself? Yep, more than 10 times. Increasing the budget leads to the reduction in crime. False. Correct. What is the minimum schooling requirement? Yep, correct. That's high school. That for some reason didn't get on here was this. In what era did the police begin to form in the US? I'm just curious what people think. If you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat. So what era did the police begin to form in the US? The 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, or that they've always existed? Okay, yep, it's 1700s, yeah. Okay, so wow, it appears that we have some like pretty high prior knowledge of folks coming in, so that's great. Okay, so some of the common police myths that I'd like for us to talk about. That police have always existed in the US. The presence of police decreases crime and violence. Police spend most of their time stopping violent crimes. We need to give police a chance to reform itself because they haven't had a chance to do so. Increasing police budgets lead to less crime. And if we root out the bad apples, then policing will work for everyone because only white cops are racist and commit police brutality. So, regarding the first common myth, police have always existed in the US. Well, we just learned that nope, that's not the case. They didn't, the origins of policing are in the 1700s. So in the South, the origins of policing is rooted in slave patrols that were created in the early 1700s. In 1704, the colony of Carolina developed our nation's first slave patrol. And slave patrols, the whole point of them was to maintain the economic order and to assist the wealthy slave owners in recovering and punishing their quote unquote property, the enslaved Africans who were fighting for their freedom and liberation. So the whole purpose of slave patrols was to basically catch and recover runaway slaves. That's the origins of policing in the South. In the West, Indian constables were the roots of policing as they targeted indigenous peoples who were forced westward under the Indian removal policies during the 1830s. And in the Northeast, the roots of policing can be found in union busting, the labor force primarily being composed of immigrants, so Italians, Irish, the Polish, during the early 1980s as the US opened up its borders to European immigrants. So what does this history tell us? It tells us that the roots of policing are deeply oppressive, targeting the poor, the working class, and Black and Indigenous communities and people of color. It tells us that the primary objective, the primary job of the police was to control and surveil non-white bodies in an effort to protect white interests, their property and their money. And the roots of MPD is also the same. This poster was created by Ricardo Levins Morales, and it was done around the campaign for justice for Jamar Clark when he was murdered. And it's Minneapolis, protecting wealth and whiteness since 1867. The police was originally created to protect the economic interests of the ruling class, of white people. It was never about preventing or reducing crime or keeping people safe, which is what the police want you to think is the function of the police. Public safety and crime prevention was never the original function of the police, and it's still not today. It never was, and it never will. Rather, the original function of the police was all about protecting white property and white money, protecting white supremacy. And we see this play out we saw this play out in our city, with the National Guard being fortified to protect white money and white property during the Chauvin trial. The police operate from a logic of property over people, not people over property. So these are the roots of policing in this country, which is why when we talk of abolition, abolishing, meaning to take up by the roots, we literally mean uproot the entire system, because these roots right here are rotten to the core. But more important than that, we need to abolish the police, because these roots are inherently racist and white supremacist and works against poor white communities and Black and Indigenous communities and communities of color. So for those of you who say that police murders need to stop, the only way for that to happen is through the abolition of the police. We believe in a world, this is coming from 8 to Abolition. We believe in a world where there are 0 police murders because there are 0 police. Why wouldn't we want to live in a world where police murders are a thing of the past? Why wouldn't we want to advocate for laws and policies and practices that simply put a Band-Aid solution on police murders? Why would we want to do that? Is this the type of world that you want for your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren? This is not about politics. It's not about right or left. It's not about radical or conservative. This is about common decency. It's about living up to our values, that human life is to be respected and honored, and that people are more important than dollar bills or buildings. The second common myth, the presence of police decreases crime and violence. This is absolutely false. Research and statistics reveal that the presence of police is a threat to public safety. I'm going to say that again. The presence of police is a threat to public safety. When there is less contact between police and the public, there is less police violence. And the evidence lies in the suburbs. There's less police presence in the suburbs than in the city, leading to less crime and violence in the suburbs and more crime and violence in the city. Not because the city is more dangerous and the suburbs are less, but because over-policing leads to more interactions with the public, leading to more police violence and more opportunities to identify crimes because more eyes are on the lookout for wrongdoing. So when I live in Uptown right now, and before Uptown, I lived in Brooklyn Center. And Brooklyn Center, there were cops everywhere. Like you could get caught so easily for rolling through a stop sign, for speeding. I mean, there were cops literally everywhere. Uptown, I live right on the artery of Uptown on Hennepin Avenue, and there are folks speeding, whizzing by all the time. So in both Brooklyn Center and Uptown, people are breaking traffic laws all the time. And yet, it's only in Brooklyn Center where they get caught mostly, and not in Uptown because there are more police presence there. Police spend most of their time stopping violent crimes. This too is absolutely false. The percentage of time that the police spend in responding to violent crimes, like I said, is minuscule. It's 4%. Most of their time is spent on non-criminal and non-violent issues, such as responding to noise complaints, issuing parking and traffic citations, and other non-criminal issues, which make up from 33 to 40% of their time. We need to give police a chance to reform itself because they haven't had a chance to change. We've given the police chance after chance to reform itself. 3 different times at the federal level. So the federal government created commissions to reform the police in 1894, 1931, and 1967. Numerous task forces have been set up and laws passed, And local and state governments also introduced reform measures in 1991 after the Rodney King murder, in 2014 and 2016 after the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and in 2020 after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And as we learned, the MPD has had numerous attempts to reform itself in its 150-year-long tenure. However, despite over a century of police reform efforts, police brutality and police violence are getting worse, not better. Why? Because the system of policing is rotten to the core. You can't reform something that is rotten at its core. And you can't trust the police to police themselves. Think of it this way. Saying that we need to reform police is like saying we need to reform slavery. How do you make slavery less racist, less harmful, less abusive? How do you make slave masters more kind, friendly, more community-centered? Trying to reform the police makes about as much sense as trying to reform slavery rather than abolishing it. Increasing police budgets leads to less crime. Although national crime rates were already on the downward trend in the early 1990s, police budgets all over the nation ballooned since 1995 after the landmark National Crime Bill was passed, which led to federal funds being used to offset local and state police departments. And as a result, about a third of state budgets go directly to the police. Since 1995, US homicide rates have dropped by a third. However, police spending has increased by 46% nationally, and in some cities, even more than that. So it might be tempting to make a direct correlation that, oh, police budgets are greater than ever, and now we have lower crime. But resist that temptation, because data analysis of 473 cities nationwide has proven that police spending doesn't correlate with crime, because many cities spend the same exact amount of money and have very different crime rates. And cities that allocated more funds to police did not experience more or less crime in any predictable pattern. If we root out the bad apples, then policing will work for everyone because only white cops are racist and commit police brutality. So race, as you all know, plays a huge factor in the ways that communities experience the police. And its foundation of policing is racism. That is what, the whole point that when we heard about, or we learned about the origins of policing being rooted in policing Black bodies, Native bodies, and new immigrant bodies coming in. So because we continue to live in this white supremacist society, we're conditioned, all of us, to hold implicit biases against Black and brown people, even if you identify as Black or brown. Rashawn Ray, a sociology professor at the University of Maryland, he studies race and policing, and his research revealed that when officers take the implicit association test, they all exhibit anti-Black bias, even Black officers. And other studies have revealed that everyone, regardless of race, has an anti-Black, pro-white bias. By the time that we are 3 years old, people, and the research is already out on this, by the time we're 3 years of age, all of us have developed a pro-white, anti-Black bias, simply by living in this country. So it's untrue and inaccurate to say that only white cops are racist and commit police brutality. This isn't about a few bad apples. It's about an entire system that is built on a code of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. So what's the difference between reform, defund, and abolition? So MPD150, we created this graphic to illustrate the futile cycle of police reform. So an instance of police brutality, police murder happens. which leads to outrage and protest. And it spurs conversations like the one we're having right now on abolition. But instead of actual change happening, it leads to police reform. So whether it's introducing body cams or banning chokeholds or implementing implicit bias training for all cops, etc. Then time passes and things go back to the same old until another Black or brown body is murdered by the police and the cycle starts all over again. I want to share this video with you. It is a testimony by Tony Williams, a core member of MPD150, where he exposes how rotten MPD is at its core and therefore why reform won't work. So 1 second as I pull up that video.
My name is Tony Williams. I live in Councilmember Reich's ward. So first I want to draw attention to this altar of victims of police brutality we have of the Minneapolis Police Department. From listening to a lot of the speakers tonight, you would think that the police department doesn't do anything other than play sports with kids. And we here have a lot of evidence that that's not the case. So I want to name some of the folks that we have pictured here. Courtney Williams, Barbara Schneider, Dominic Felder, Quincy Smith, Justine Damon, Travis Jordan, Terrence Franklin, Jamar Clark, Thurman Blevins. We honor them. So we got one of the emails that the police sent in order to turn out people for the hearing tonight. And here are basically the things that it said. So it said, if there's a divestment from the department, and I do support a 5% divestment from the police department, said any police service not 911 related will stop. It said the Police Activities League will be disbanded. It said the community engagement team will cease to exist. And it said the expansion of group violence intervention, which is not funded through the police department, will not happen. So I think it says a lot that when we talk about a $30 million expansion in the budget over the last 5 years, that the second that there's any talk of divestment of anything from the department, they immediately threaten to cut all the wonderful programs that get people out here to talk about how great the police department is. This is why we shouldn't be funding these programs within the department, because the second that we try to take away any of their money for guns or SWAT, the $2.5 million expansion for the special operations that's in the budget this year, they immediately turn around and threaten to cut all of the programming. So I guess the question really is, how important is that programming to them if that's immediately what's on the chopping block the first second that they turn around? That email ended, change is a process that occurs over time. So how much time is that exactly? So Tony Buzzo was hired as the great reformer of the department in 1980. He left in 1989, said the department was a bunch of thumpers when he came in, was a bunch of thumpers when he left. He put out editorial in Southside Pride 2 years ago that said that he had failed to reform the department. Janae Harteau, our first chief of color, our first queer chief, hired to be the great reformer of the department in 2012, left in 2017, fired because culture change wasn't happening enough. Now we have Chief Arredondo, an officer who actually sued the department for white supremacy, naming one particular officer as the most racist officer on the force, Bob Kroll. Bob Kroll was reappointed by the rank and file in 2017 with a 2-to-1 vote. So when you start talking about culture change, when you start trying to talk about shifting the culture of this department, we need to understand that that's been tried for decades and decades. No one has succeeded so far, and no one will, because the second anybody pushes back on them, they send every email that they can to turn out people based on their few community support programs. So I am asking for a 5% divestment, and I am really thankful to the council for being willing to think critically and not just listen to what you're told by the department about the ways to keep our city safe. Thank you.
Okay. So, Tony played a major role in writing up this report. He is a journalist, a writer, a poet. So I just wanted to lift up his name, but his testimony is so very powerful. History proves and within the within MPD, Tony has shared that reforms don't work. The police cannot police themselves. Why? Because it goes against their self-interest to do so. And the fact that they choose to cut the positive things that they do for the community first over all else says a lot about how much they really care about the community. They really don't care about the community because they were never created to care about the community. We need to break this cycle, folks. This cycle right here. Abolition breaks that cycle. How? By uprooting the current system and planting different seeds in order to build something brand new that operates from a totally different set of values, principles, and objectives. As Ruthie Gilmore says, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions rather than reforming death-inducing ones. Here are some videos that help us to differentiate between defund and abolition. And I wanted to show both of these, but because of time, I'm just going to show this one. So 1 second while I pull that up.
I think it's super important that we differentiate between abolishing, defunding, and reforming the police. Regardless of which action you support, let's just start by saying what we mean and not conflating ideas to make it more palatable for people. Let's start with reform. By and large, most people would agree that the criminal justice system ain't it. It's not perfect. Police reform looks to specifically introduce positive change to police conduct with things like more training, new technology, so body cams, and community policing. The ideology behind police reform is that while the system isn't perfect, with enough focus and care, we can limit the ability of police officers to abuse their power or endanger the lives of the people they're supposed to protect. Now, this is different than the call to defund police because reforms are ultimately going to cost more money, incentivizing a larger budget for the police department. Whereas defunding the police calls for lowering the budget and reallocating those funds to support community health and public services. Those who want to defund the police believe that the more money police have, the more dangerous they become, which we can see in the way that many departments around the nation have become militarized without need, or how having more money to get more cops results in over-policing in poor neighborhoods. Where reformists allocate focus and care to the police department, those who want to defund the police shift that focus and care to the community itself, hopefully lowering the need for police intervention and subsequently lowering opportunities for any abuse of power. Both of our current presidential prospects oppose the idea of defunding the police, but the movement has found more traction amongst local governance. Now, where defunding and abolishing the police part ways is in their end game. Most abolitionists would agree that the police should be defunded, but only as a means to an end, not as the end in itself. Abolishing the police means rejecting the idea that the police department can be altered or reformed in any meaningful way, even with a slash to the budget. Make sure you check out the work of organizations like Critical Resistance and Reclaim the Block to learn more about what abolitionists call reformist reforms, or reforms that constantly need to be revisited and reformed later on. But before we talk about the complexities of abolition, we need to first acknowledge that this is not a new conversation. For many of us, the abolition movement is only on our radar due to the current national spotlight on state-sanctioned killings of Black people by police. But people beyond this moment, specifically Black women, have been pointing us towards the goals of abolition for decades. Scholars and educators like Mariam Kaba, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mark Lamont Hill, Angela Davis, these are all people we should be listening to, following, learning from if we're new to the idea or if we have questions. But when we paint this as something new, then we create room for people to dismiss the entire movement as naive. Abolitionists believe that we should be focused on creating the conditions in which police are not needed in our society at all, not one of them. And creating those conditions involves something I like to call the 3 Ds. The first D is defund, which we've already talked about as divesting from police and investing in community-driven programs that promote health and safety. Then we've got decentralize, which means redistributing the functions and responsibilities of the police to groups that are specifically trained in those areas. Currently, the police are expected to meet way too many public needs, from traffic stops to welfare checks to, in the case of George Floyd, the suspected use of counterfeit bills. Even the response response to violent crimes can be the responsibility of a much smaller, specialized force. The third D is decriminalize, lowering the bar for what's considered a criminal offense. Things like sex work, drug use, homelessness, or vagrancy are criminal offenses that aren't inherently violent or unsafe, and with proper support and regulation can function without police intervention. That's just a few of the ways that abolitionists work to create the conditions that we need. The things like decarceration and restorative justice that also plays a huge part in what it means to be an abolitionist. But none of those steps or Ds should be mistaken for abolition itself. The goal of abolition is exactly as it states, to abolish the police. And if we're not clear on that goal, we can't ever get there. And if we're not as clear as possible about what we're doing, we run the risk of maybe dismantling and disbanding some police departments, but then creating a system that's just as harmful, or recreating police departments under a different name. It happened with the 13th Amendment and slavery, and it can happen again today. We also have to abolish the idea that the police exist to protect us. We've watched one too many cop shows and have created this collective mythos about who the police are and how they function in our society. We've had this trope about a few bad apples drilled into our minds, so now whenever the institution is challenged, we can't help but retreat and protect the individuals that are associated with it. For abolition movements across history, the biggest barrier has always been a lack of imagination. Some of us, though, have never had these illusions, or had them dispelled really early through consistent interactions with an institution with police that sought to brutalize, violate, and scapegoat our communities. But what else is to be expected from an organization that finds its origin in the early 1700s as slave patrol, later evolving into segregation enforcement and keeping freed slaves in check? Police have always existed to protect property over people. They've always protected each other over the communities that they were there to serve. At this point, we're done with them failing us. So if you're an abolitionist, say it proudly. Don't water down the movement to appease the sensibilities of people you think might not understand. And if you're not an abolitionist and you identify more with defunding or reforming the police, say it with your chest. Stop co-opting abolition when you're not actually about that life. That does a disservice to everyone. The clearer we are, the easier it is to move forward.
Okay. So I just wanted to share some resources here. So if you're short on time, I'm hoping, let's see. I'm hoping that this will copy and paste into the chat. Oh, good, it worked. Okay, so if you're short on time, MPD 150 has frequently asked questions about the police, and you can go check out the resources page there. That's where you can find that. You can learn more about the report and the work, and work through the resources page. We have all kinds of articles and books and links, you know, to go for your own self-education. And you can also order the report at that link that's shared in the chat, and then follow the work of Miriam Kaba, Critical Resistance, Project NIA, Angela Davis, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore are just some of the few abolitionists who have been leading the charge on this for many, many years. And here, I really love this graphic because a lot of people are so scared about the word abolition, you know, because again, it's like, it's about abolishing, and they're like, oh, well, what do we do? Like going from like, you know, police to like having zero police. And it's like, no, it's not like that. When we talk about abolition, we realize that it's a gradual change. And so I just want to read this quote that is in our frequently asked questions. Police abolition work is not about snapping our fingers and magically defunding every department in the world instantly. Rather, we're talking about a process of strategically reallocating resources, funding, and responsibility away from police and toward community-based models of safety, support, and prevention. So in the same way that, you know, our country is working to be, carbon neutral. We don't all of a sudden shut all the coal mines, and all the oil pipelines and stuff like that. It's like a gradual shift. And in the same way, that is the work of abolition, and defunding is the way to get to that gradual shift. And so that's the first step, defunding the police. And then here's some other ways to work towards abolition: demilitarizing communities, removing police from schools, free people from from prisons and jails, repeal laws that criminalize survival. So, people are doing things just to survive, and you shouldn't be penalized for that or criminalized for that. Invest in community self-governance, provide safe housing for everyone, invest in care, not cops. And I just want to leave you with these final words. Just as a reminder, the foundation of policing is built on racist, classist, sexist, and ableist values, which are cancerous to our society. We've finally gotten to the point where our society has recognized that racism is a public health crisis. Given that, why would we want to reform anything that has at its foundations racist principles and objectives? If we truly believe that racism is a public health crisis, then people would stop working towards reform and instead demand something brand new with a new set of values that are anti-racist, a new set of objectives that are anti-classist and anti-sexist, with a new set of DNA. Again, reforming the police makes as much sense as reforming slavery. We abolished slavery in the 19th century. Let's abolish policing in the 21st. Thanks, folks.
Thank you so much, Sujin, for the presentation this evening. We just have a couple minutes left here, and so I'm not sure if we have any time for quick questions or comments, but I just want to say that, again, this is a first conversation, and we have next week, Tuesday, May 4th at 7 p.m., the second part of this conversation, which is creating the future of community safety. And so I think to build on the information that we've heard about tonight, to come to that next week's conversation with thoughts that this conversation tonight may have brought up for you, is definitely welcome. And then beyond next Tuesday, we'll be having some additional conversations through the neighborhood that will be more discussion based and connecting with neighbors, facilitated by neighbors. And so I just want to reiterate that everyone is welcome. I think whether you are new to this conversation or have been in this conversation and have been doing your own learning and action and things like that, you are welcome. I think whether things resonated with you tonight, whether things brought up fear or anger or skepticism, you are still welcome to be a part of these conversations going forward, because we know we need to work together as a neighborhood to have safety beyond policing, and we want everyone to be a part of those conversations, no matter where you're coming from for that. So I just want to make sure that that is very clear to people, that this conversation and this work absolutely continues, and we want you all to be a part of that.
And I also want to point out that the second part, where Sheila Najad will be presenting and facilitating, that's where a lot of your questions around, your questions about public safety, or what does public safety look like without police? That's where a lot of that will be discussed, because that session is specifically focused on exactly that. What does public safety look like without the police? So bring your questions, the questions that we weren't able to get to today, bring your questions next week.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. You'll receive a follow-up email. If you are interested in receiving the MPD 150 report, please let us know. We've also recorded tonight and we'll make this available to people on the YouTube channel of KFNA.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.